lost. With a pink hotel, a boutique, and a swinging hot spot. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? It's a paradise, whatever parking lot.
We can't just continually expand our infrastructure to accommodate future growth. We can't pave over everything. At some point, we can no longer sustainably grow outward as a city or pave new roads to reduce congestion. At some point, we need to use, in economic terms, pricing signals to encourage the more efficient use of the existing infrastructure. In a planning context, this is called demand management.
A few days of rain has been welcomed into Taitokerau Northland, Auckland and Hawke's Bay. But NIWA scientists say all of those regions need a bigger deluge to turn around their respective droughts. The demand for water is set to increase in the future, but so too are these long periods of dry weather. So, how do we get people to conserve water? Would charging directly for water help? Fiona Owen put those questions to the experts.
A rainy day in Auckland this afternoon, but is it enough?
Nope.
Auckland University climatologist Dr Anthony Fowler.
Well, I'm getting wet here, but I do think we still have a crisis coming, not quite here yet in my view. I think we maybe have overhyped it a little bit. This is what was planned for, that occasionally you would run out of water. But to me, the big question, as I said before, is what about climate change? Has climate changed so much that, in fact, the water planning is actually wrong at the moment, and that we're actually sensitive to maybe more frequent crises than we might be anticipating?
One of the more conservative scenarios put forward by our climate change scientists is that by the middle of this century, most parts of New Zealand will spend 35 more days on average a year in drought. On top of that, our demand for water is increasing.
This is creeping up on us, you might say, but give it another 20 or 30 years and things could be quite different. And infrastructure for things like water storage takes decades to plan and build, and then it's going to be there for 50 to 100 years. So it's a long-term prospect, and if we want it to be right in 30 years' time, I think we'd better be working on it right now.
The irony is that New Zealand has an abundance of water, miles of rivers and streams, lakes, 200 aquifers, and a relatively high rainfall, especially on the west coast and Fiordland, where the average rainfall is 8,000 millimetres, but in some places up to 13,000. That's 13 metres of rain, and an average of 200 rain days a year.
So all you need to do is put a big pipe through the Southern Alps and everything's sorted. I wish it was that simple. And, well, I suppose you could do that. The west coast of the South Island, Fiordland, just near the Southern Alps, some of the wettest places in the world, actually.
Well, I guess that sort of water harvesting in that regard has merit, and there has been talk in the past about water tankers taking water to the Middle East, but it always falls down on the cost. You need an enormous infrastructure to be able to move water across mountains and so on, and it's not like we really can do that. So I would say no.
This is where the water from the Mediterranean enters the plant.
For an island nation, desalination may seem like an obvious solution. It's transformed water supply in places like Israel and Western Australia.
I wouldn't recommend desalination unless you have to do it. It's expensive, it's got ecological implications as well. I would say our best bet would probably be to take water from the Waikato when it was in flood or in high flow, where you're not competing with other users, and somehow store that.
Western Australia is also a leader in converting sewage and wastewater to drinking water.
Well, it's got the yuck factor, hasn't it? Nobody liked that idea at all. Yeah, it could be done. It certainly could be done for non-potable or non-drinking applications. And the thing about water is that 30% of it we flush down the toilet or use on the garden. We don't drink it. So we don't need necessarily pristine quality water for everything we do.
But perhaps Aucklanders should get used to the idea of drinking recycled water, like many cities do, as Watercare recently indicated it's not a matter of if, but when. In the meantime, we're told water conservation countrywide needs to become more second nature.
To treasure it, to use it sparingly, and the one way of doing that is the fact that we pay for it. So Aucklanders are actually use a lot less water than most places in New Zealand because we pay for our water.
In 2017, Central Hawke's Bay farmers lost the opportunity to build their Ruataniwha Dam, but work will begin soon on 3 large reservoirs in Northland, all backed by the Provincial Growth Fund. With issues around water supply, allocation and quality becoming more critical every year, does it deserve to be managed at the highest level?
Ministry of Water? Absolutely.
I'm not really a fan of proliferating ministries and organisations, but if that's what it takes to bring this higher up the political agenda, then yes, it probably is a good idea.
As the rain comes down at Victoria University, Dr. James Renwick concedes there are uncertainties about the rate of change expected in New Zealand's climate.
And we could be caught out by quite significant changes that accumulate over the next 20 or so years. So I would just, like to say that we need to be adapting more and planning more for the changes that are already underway, because if we leave it too much longer, we're going to be in serious trouble.
Earlier, we talked briefly about the differences in marginal costs for developing infrastructure inside urban areas versus on the fringes of an urban area. Let's take that example a bit further. Cities are built to accommodate lots of people, and roads are optimized in such a way that the periphery can bring swift-moving traffic through the city and accommodate the traffic within a city using a number of smaller roads, pedestrian and bike facilities, and public transport. But, as we'll talk about in a minute, all of this infrastructure is not always used in the most efficient way. In a similar vein, the infrastructure that runs underneath the city, primarily the water pipes, the sewer pipes, even the power lines, are built to accommodate large numbers of people. So if we were to add, say, 10,000 extra people to a single city block, the cost to extend that same infrastructure up into the apartment building and to each individual living unit in that building is much smaller than the cost to extend that same type of infrastructure out into what we might call greenfields, or areas that have not yet been developed. In order to accommodate growth on the urban fringes, we must first bring the roads, the pipes, the sewer lines, new water treatment facilities, pumping stations, all of these things out to the urban fringe, then extend that infrastructure to each individual development, and then offshoots to each individual housing unit. The cost of all that infrastructure per additional development, per additional person, is enormous when compared to the cost of development in cities. This alone isn't the issue. The problem starts from an economics perspective in the way that we price things. It's a perverse incentive. What does that mean? A perverse incentive is something through which pricing signals is more attractive because it carries a low price and thus consumed much more, even though it should be much more expensive and consumed at a much lower rate. Let's unpack that a little. The idea here is that it is much less expensive from an infrastructure point of view for a developer to build a house or a housing development out in the fringes of the city. In many cases, the land costs less, there are fewer regulations and fewer numbers of reviews, fewer permits to pull, and as a result, the overall cost and speed at which something could be developed is much faster. At the same time, the cost of receiving services on the urban fringe for the individual, that is, the people that live in these developments, is essentially the same as those that live in the city, because most governments charge the average cost for services. If we look at water services provided to people that live in the city and people who live in the suburbs, the way that governments typically price these services is through average costing. That is, the total cost of providing water services divided by the total number of units of water consumed in a service area. For simplicity, no matter where that water was consumed, everyone is typically charged the same price per unit of water. Despite the cost of providing water to individuals that live in the urban fringe being substantially higher, many multiples in some cases, than the cost of providing that very same water service to people in urban areas. Through a demand management viewpoint, developers should be charged more per unit developed, and individuals that live in the suburbs should be charged much more per unit of water consumed than those in an urban area. In this case, it would encourage more efficient use of the urban infrastructure, as developers would try to develop more units and create higher densities in areas where the infrastructure is already developed, and less density in the urban fringe areas where the per unit cost of infrastructure is much higher. If both developers and residents were charged more for the real-world cost of infrastructure, that is, the marginal cost of infrastructure provision, our cities would be able to much more efficiently develop and maintain vital infrastructure. In a similar vein, transportation can be priced in a way that better manages demand and encourages more efficient travel behavior. For example, parking in cities is often very cheap in comparison to the cost of that urban land. Parking is often the least efficient land use. A surface car park or a parking structure consumes a significant amount of land, but provides very little in return. Significantly reducing the number of spaces or charging more for each space will reduce the demand for such infrastructure. If it's more expensive to park in the city, developers will build less parking, and the land will be used in a more efficient way. Drivers will choose to park, perhaps in the outskirts of the city, and take public transport into the city, or decide to use active modes of transportation for their entire journey. All of this makes for more efficient use of urban transportation infrastructure. The same pricing signals can be used for roads. A growing number of cities use demand management techniques to price out roads or urban centers in order to reduce the demand for those facilities at peak hours. As a result, they reduce the need to continually expand those roads. Road demand management is typically referred to as congestion pricing.
Congestion pricing was invented here in New York City. William Vickery in the 1950s, an economics professor who later went on to win the Nobel Prize for economics, came up with this concept that one of the most precious resources in a city is space. And that space needs to be priced, just like we price theater tickets, we price the airlines during the holiday season or hotel rooms, the same way we should price Fifth Avenue space. So congestion pricing is a way of setting a price so that we can achieve a level of service. Stockholm has congestion pricing. Gothenburg is about to do it in 2013. Singapore has been doing it for over 35 years now. We go to London and we see that they've introduced congestion pricing.
The main purpose of congestion charging is to reduce traffic and congestion. So in cities like London, road space is a really scarce resource, and we've got lots of competing demands for that space. We've got cars, freight, buses, taxis, pedestrians, cyclists. We also want to use space for public squares, street cafes, things like that. So congestion charging is a means of allocating that limited space, whereby motorists who want to drive on the roads within the zone pay a charge. Every day, if they want to drive in the zone, they pay £8, and this applies Monday to Friday, 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. Since the introduction of congestion charging, we've seen traffic in the zone reduced by about 20%. In practice, that means about 90,000 fewer vehicles in the zone every day. In 2008-9, there was about £150 million in net revenue the charging scheme raised. By law, we have to use that money to put back into the transport system. And that was used for investment in buses, in cycling facilities, in walking, in maintenance.
The people that are in their cars are moving faster, and the people that are in the subways are getting some kind of revenue stream that assists them in getting to their destinations faster. We're using less of the planet, lower carbon footprints, the air quality is better, we're all better off.
An economist would say you have a certain amount of a good. How are you going to distribute that good? You can ration it by price or by queue. If you sort of underprice something, you're going to have a queue. When a store like Costco has these sort of like Thanksgiving flat TV specials where there's a flat TV for $200, what happens? You have a line of people at the door in the morning because it's underpriced TV. So I think roads are sort of the same way. We give away road space for essentially nothing in this country. We have some of the lowest fuel taxes in the world. They don't pay for themselves. And it's no surprise that the result of that is our queues. We could choose to distribute that space differently through pricing. You wouldn't expect to fly home at Christmas and pay the same for flying in the middle of sort of September. And when there's peak demand in other areas of life, you pay more. The roads, we sort of just give it all away and then we're surprised.
Congestion charging helps to encourage people out of their cars and onto other modes of transport, such as public transport or cycling. And our monitoring shows that about 70% of people affected by the charge have actually switched to other modes. When charging was introduced, we saw an increase of about a third in the numbers of people coming into central London by bus during charging hours. About half of this is directly attributable to congestion charging.
At the end of the day, it's about the value of your time. Your time has a value, if it's leisure time, if it's work time, and being able to pay to get home faster, pay to get to work faster, pay to meet your friends faster, whatever it is that you're going to do, we should have the ability to do that. So road pricing lets us do that. First of all, we have an infrastructure problem in this country. Second, we have a deficit problem. Third, oil prices are going up. So this is kind of a perfect storm of concern. I think on the left and on the right, there's starting to be a realization that we need to find solutions that make sense to fiscal conservatives, to environmentalists, to security folks, to people that are looking at this from a transportation angle or an energy angle, and really can move us forward in terms of opening a more competitive market among transportation modes.
Let's face it, the supply and demand curve for gasoline has always been related to the size of the middle class. Well, folks, we're going to see a quintupling of the middle class with the Chinese middle class coming online, the Russian and Eastern Bloc countries coming online. That supply-demand curve means that demand is growing. Any world city that wants to compete in the 21st and is thinking about the 22nd century needs to think about congestion pricing.
We'll talk more about growth management techniques, congestion pricing, and better integrating infrastructure and urban growth in the coming weeks.